This week on Quadriga, Ukraine escalation, right or might? The tension in eastern Ukraine is getting worse by the day. This week saw the first deaths during clashes between pro-Russian commandos and soldiers of the Kiev-controlled army. Ukraine's acting president, Alexander Turchinov, has described the fighters as terrorists and said others would be put on trial. The latest meeting of Russia, Ukraine, the US and the EU produced an agreement to de-escalate the crisis and disarm pro-Russian groups. Meanwhile, Russia's President Vladimir Putin has been talking about the importance of dialogue. He denies Russian troops are in Ukraine, but has not ruled out sending them. Is more fighting inevitable in eastern Ukraine? Does the appeal to international law have any relevance in this struggle? Your host this week, Melinda Crane.
Hello and welcome to Quadriga. Where is the situation in Ukraine heading? Is a diplomatic or political solution feasible? And if so, what might it look like? Those are some of the questions we want to pose to three journalists who've been following developments in Ukraine very closely. And I'm very pleased to welcome Irina Solonenko. She's a Ukrainian political scientist at the European University Viadrina here in Germany. Previously, she worked with George Soros Open Society Foundations and the East-West Institute in Ukraine. And it's a pleasure to have with us Ivan Rodionov. He is editor-in-chief of the Russian news agency Ruptli, which is part of the Russian state-funded broadcaster Russia Today. He previously worked as deputy editor-in-chief at another Russian state broadcaster, Rossiya 24. And it's a pleasure to welcome Anton Troyanovsky. He's an American journalist of Russian origin. As correspondent for the Wall Street Journal based here in Berlin, he recently covered the Crimea referendum and the Sochi Olympics. He previously reported from Moscow for the Washington Post and the AP news agency. I'd like to start out by getting an assessment from all three of you about whether you think Ukraine might be heading, as Russia warned it could, toward civil war. Irina Solonenko.
Well, the situation is very tense now. I don't see really preconditions for the civil war. According to last opinion polls in eastern regions of Ukraine, up to 20% might want to join Russia, but the rest are really pro-Ukrainian. We don't see massive pro-Ukrainian demonstrations in eastern Ukraine. People are afraid. They are more passive than people in Kiev or western Ukraine. But I don't see any preconditions for civil war without external interference. And this external interference brings up tensions, and this might lead to some sort of fighting. I hope no civil war, actually.
Ivan Rodionov, how do you see it?
Well, this presumed Russian interference, Russia meddling in eastern Ukraine appears more and more like Saddam Hussein's chemical labs 2.0, pardon. Everybody talks about presumed Russian aggression, but nobody's seen any Russian troops there. And how could they get into Ukraine? There's a border, and the Russian journalists who are trying to go to Ukraine to report from there are denied entrance to the country because, for no reason sometimes, or on really laughable reasons, like they do not have enough funds to sustain themselves in Ukraine during 2 or 3 weeks.
Let's say it's not Russian troops, but possibly Russian agents provocateurs, agents trying to stir up trouble. And something that puzzled me today, Vladimir Putin said in a call-in show in Moscow, we don't have anybody in eastern Ukraine, but the fact is he said the same thing about Crimea when it was going on, and now, today, for the first time, he admitted Russia did have agents in Crimea. Why should we believe him this time around?
Russia did have like 16,000 agents in Crimea. That's actually the military personnel that was, according to the treaty between Russia and Ukraine, stationed, deployed there in Sevastopol. And small wonder that the soldiers didn't stay in the barracks while the country was sinking into chaos and civil war. But that's a different issue. If we speak of eastern Ukraine, if you imply and assume those are Russian agents, but don't produce any evidence, it really looks puzzling to me. And why wouldn't we assume that those same armed people are Ukrainian citizens and officers or employees of the Ukrainian police and army, which abandons the Kiev government massively, as you see now with this attempted crackdown in all those eastern Ukrainian cities, which failed. The army is changing sides, the police is changing sides.
Okay,
so
I want to come
my
back to that
assumption
in
is
just a minute.
it's Ukrainian citizens, Ukrainian army or police officers taking the buildings the way it happened before in Kiev.
Okay, let's come back to that point shortly. Anton Troyanov, the question of whether there are Russian agents in some way helping to foment separatist sentiment. Intelligence services apparently have said in the West they do believe Russia is playing a role in doing so. What do you think? Who should we believe?
If you listen to even different governments in the West, the assessments are different. Obviously, the U.S. has been very direct in saying they believe the unrest in eastern Ukraine has been fomented by the Russians. Here in Germany, they've been a little softer and said, they suspect that this is going on. In Kiev itself, the current government there has said there's Russian involvement in the unrest, but there hasn't been hard proof. I think that's true. But I think to your question on the civil war, it comes down to what do people who have lived in the same country peacefully for decades, is there really enough kind of pent-up tension or pent-up hatred, for that matter, to bring civil war? I hope not. I think the world hopes not. But unfortunately, we've been surprised quite a bit in the last few months.
But why then, I'm sorry, that right sector and Dmitry Yarosh is sending his paramilitaries to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, as he sees that the army, in his view, fails to crack down on those protesters? Why then? If you say there is no sentiment, actually...
Right sector is a small group of radicals. They are maybe 300 people. Yarosh announced he will run presidential elections. He has less than 1% support. Let's not overestimate
but 4 ministers in the cabinet.
That's Svoboda party. That's a difference. It's a party which has seats in the parliament. This is the case in any country. If you have seats in the parliament, you become part of the cabinet.
I'm sorry if I do not discern correctly between various fascist parties in Ukraine. But, I'll say
on which grounds you call them fascist, that's one thing.
Svoboda actually was born under the name National Socialist Party of Ukraine.
So the last time the leader of Svoboda mentioned something which was anti-Jewish, it was 2004, and afterwards he was expelled from the Our Ukraine party. It's another party which was headed by former President Viktor Yushchenko. Since then, he didn't mention anything like that. And I have to say that his support is also 1%. He will run presidential elections as well. So let's not overestimate. They play a minor role, a small group of radicals. And radical rights have much more support in European countries.
Overrepresented in the government, right?
Hungarian elections and the Jobbik party. Let's recall Marie Le Pen party in Hungary. We'll see what kind of outcome of elections for the European Parliament. So radical right parties have much more support in Western Europe, and it's not a problem. Why do you raise this problem in Ukraine, where they have much less support?
I mean, I think that this talk of who's fascist and who isn't misses some of the point, which is that even in Crimea, where there was truly a lot of support for breaking away from Ukraine and from joining Russia, I mean, some of it was patriotism, but you could also tell there were just people who were disillusioned with the politics of Kiev, who felt that there hadn't been enough investment in Crimea, and who just thought they could live better economically in Russia. So I think we may well be seeing some of that in eastern Ukraine right now. But I don't think we need to boil all of this down to ethnic divisions or who's fascist and who isn't. There are, there are other, I think, factors.
Irina Solonenko, let me ask you this. You say Russia appears to be playing a role in fomenting dissatisfaction and separatist sentiment. But do you really believe that Putin has a clear strategy of doing so and has a real playbook for dismembering Ukraine?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, long time ago, Zbigniew Brzezinski told that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. What I see now is a very sort of imperialistic sentiments in Russia. We have 80% of support for Putin. And this policy is aimed at destabilizing Ukraine. Putin already told today that he will not recognize, he kind of hinted that he will not recognize presidential elections. He's talking about federalism, which would disintegrate the country. If Ukraine succeeds as a democratic, prosperous country, it will be a threat for Putin's regime, and he understands that. So, of course, his strategy...
May I just ask you, why would you destabilize a neighbor in which economy you have like billions of vested interest by the Russian business? I mean, who destabilizes a country just next door to you? What sense does it make? Do you have any answers? Russian business invested billions in the Ukrainian infrastructure, metal industry, steelworks, mobile, IT communications, everything, food, beverage industry, whatever. It's some industrial branches out of 40% owned by the Russian companies. Isn't it insane to destabilize a country? Of course, now with that government in Kiev saying that they are going to default on all Russian debts and not paying anything back, and they're going to nationalize that assets belonging to the Russian companies and the Russian individuals, it certainly gives some reason for concern within Russia. But do you have any reasonable points to actually prove that a country would destabilize another country right next door, provoking maybe floods of refugees, provoking havoc on your border, which trickles through, which spills over inevitably to your own home ground?
That argument being made by Mr. Rodionovsky is premised on the idea that Vladimir Putin would act rationally in economic terms. But if we see what his actions have been so far, I wonder if we sometimes don't operate under the wrong assumptions about what rationality would mean in this situation. Meaning, Russia is clearly already losing money, not only due to sanctions, but also due to declining trust on the part of Russians who are parking their money elsewhere. 70 billion already flowed out of Russia just in this economic quarter. Are we perhaps assuming too much rationality on the part of President Putin?
I mean, we don't even necessarily need to try to get into his head and figure out what he is and isn't thinking. But in terms of, because in terms of the consequences of what's going on, certainly there would be disadvantages to Russia to having a civil war in one of its largest neighbors. But I think it's also worth looking at what's going on inside Russia and the political situation inside Russia. We have seen, I think without a doubt, that what's gone on in the last couple of months has strengthened Vladimir Putin politically at home, at a time when economists have been concerned about the direction of the Russian economy. And this has, what has happened in the last few months has provided a pretext for clamping down further on independent media in Russia. So I think it's also, it's also worth looking at not just what's in Russia's interests outside its borders, but also what does all this mean for Putin at home.
That's a very short-term consideration, though, isn't it, Ivan Rodionov? It may be helping to shore up support for Vladimir Putin right now, but should the economy get much, much worse in coming years, will that not lead to popular sentiment turning against him?
I think it's actually the whole sort of structure seems a bit head over heels or vice versa to me. Because Putin, you portray him as someone who just reached out and grabbed Crimea out of the clear blue sky. It was not the case. First, Crimea was split by that coup d'etat in Kiev, with people extremely worried of yet another oligarch sent by Kiev coming now to rule them, like Kolomoisky or Taruta, who are also refused by the people in Donetsk or respectively Kharkiv. And with the Russian base and the geographical situation and the ethnic, the population structure of Crimea that developed, the situation escalated and ended up in that referendum, which led to the secession of Crimea from Ukraine, and then Putin, well, call it using the benefit of the moment, approved the integration of Crimea into Russia. So it was not action, it was reaction to the chain of events that started not in Moscow and maybe not in Kiev.
Let me ask you this. Vladimir Putin said today in this call-in program that he is not ruling out the possibility that he will also move into eastern Ukraine. He said he hopes he doesn't have to do it, but he has the authority to do so. Do you think he'll use that?
I think it's a misinterpretation of his words. He never said that he's going to move with the troops into eastern Ukraine. But and as we see, I'm afraid
would like ruling it out.
I would really want that you were right, and there is no danger, no threat of civil war in Ukraine. But seeing tanks and heavy artillery deployed against your own citizens is kind of reason to worry that there is still some threat and still some danger. And if that happens, then it is really totally unpredictable. It's an unpredictable situation. If it should be a war in those parts of Ukraine where now that government in Kiev tries to crack down on the protest movement using force, but fortunately, I have to say, those forces deny them allegiance and change sides and abandon those who send them to Donetsk and Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. But if at some point some of those forces don't and they start shooting at the people there, then I think it might have consequences that Vladimir Putin meant saying that quote that you just mentioned.
Irina Solonenko, does that explain why Kiev moved so slowly to quell the separatism this week? It had given an ultimatum. It said that it would act by Monday. It did not do so. Some people said it did too little, too late. Does Kiev actually have this situation under control at all?
Well, there are many people are dissatisfied with how the government is reacting. Many people in Ukraine want to see more active actions. But the explanation is that the government wants to avoid any bloodshed, and of course, if bloodshed happens, it will be a pretext for Putin to bring troops to Ukraine. So of course, they try to be careful. What we see groups of armed men in camouflage trying to occupy public buildings, TV stations, airport today in Donetsk was occupied. Of course, I mean, in any normal country, you would try to prevent this or fight with this kind of people. Yes, unfortunately, 3 of them died, of these people who tried to do these actions today, because they were shooting, they were warned to stop, but they didn't comply. So, of course, I mean, so you have to stop this somehow. But
storming and occupying public buildings. Is it something unique for the eastern Ukraine? Didn't we experience a lot of storming and occupying of public buildings in Kiev by people in camouflage?
Without arms.
Well, and those people were armed, and 28 policemen were killed, and quite a lot of protesters were shot in the back. And whereas, by the way,
not in the back.
Did that investigation produce any results that the new government should be pursuing very actively to find out who were the snipers?
If we watch video from how public buildings were occupied in Western Ukraine during the Euromaidan revolution and what is happening now, I think we will see a clear difference what kind of people are storming and occupying these buildings. And there are some videos on YouTube. There are some conversations which were allegedly leaked. I don't know, conversations which show that these are Russian military men or special forces which are operating in Ukraine. I don't have any hard
proof. You mean that Igor Bessler, that imposter?
No, there are some of them, Odessa. And Ukrainian government told that they will present the evidence in Geneva. So let's hope they will present some evidence. And
Troyanov, we have, again, 2 very different claims being made here. Kiev says, look, we have got to take action. We have a separatist uprising going on. Moscow is saying, this is unconstitutional. This is a grave crime. How do you see it? Is it truly a crime for a government to try to put down an uprising within its own borders?
I mean, this is all... This is all such a difficult situation. I think it really is really hard to assess. I mean, and you see it every day in how hard it is for the West to respond and to describe what's going on. Because as you say, there are such different analyses of what's going on. And the people, and And when you go to Crimea or these places, you realize that so much of what's happening on the ground is being driven by how people perceive, the events. And so there are truly many people in eastern Ukraine who view what happened as a coup d'etat, who do feel threatened. There are at the same time, these sort of other things going on that we hear about. It's a very hard thing, I think, for anyone to really wrap their minds around.
Irina Solonenko, what is the role of the media in shaping exactly those kind of perceptions? We know that more and more people in Eastern Russia in Eastern Ukraine are now seeing state Russian media. Is that part of what is fomenting this sentiment?
Well, actually, Russian TV was kind of prohibited in Ukraine, but still, some people in Eastern Ukraine, they can still watch it. But I mean, as I told, public opinion polls which were conducted not so long ago, just some weeks ago, showed that maximum 20% of people in Eastern Ukraine would like to join Russia. There's a lot of people, of course, which are disappointed because the economic situation with the government in Ukraine, whatever color, has not done enough for the people. And now there was a chance maybe to do some reforms. There is a chance. But in the situation
I think one interesting thing on the role of the media is, even if we look right here in Berlin, there's obviously a large Russian-speaking community here, and many Russian emigres here get their news from Russian TV. And it's interesting talking to people who get their news, to Russians here who get their news from Western media, people who get their news from Russian media. Even there, even here in Berlin, we have people with completely different evaluations of what's going on.
So what I have to agree with Irina on is that, speaking both of media and of the point that you just made, the language of the media, how those who are protesting against the government in Kiev are labeled pro-Russian separatists, which is a totally full language, because, as you rightly say, maybe 20% of them, I don't know how accurate the survey is, but I just give it the benefit of the doubt, advocate integration into Russia, while the rest is just protesting against this government that they not recognize, that they not feel represented by.
How many
and
were
they
protesting?
look,
how
we
many?
have, Irina, we have 7 journalists, veritable journalists, operating now for Rappler in Ukraine, 6 of them in eastern Ukraine, 1 in Kiev, and they send us like each 3 to 5 video stories a day showing people who took to the streets in Kharkiv, Kramatorsk, Slavyansk, and what.
So you've seen thousands
what
of
other
people
places,
protesting
with
in
lots of
favor
people
of joining Russia, right?
who show their passports and say, we are Ukrainians. We are local citizens. We don't have any Russian troops here or any Russian agents provocateurs. We just are scared of and feel threatened, as you say, by that government. We also see how actually the industry and our life standard is crumbling here, and we want to protest against it. We want to call the shots instead of having those oligarchs sent from Kiev ruling us.
Ivan Rodionov, let me ask you whether you would agree with the German government, which this week said that Russian state television is inflaming the tensions in eastern Ukraine and called on it to tone down its reporting. Do you take on that criticism? Would you say, yes, Russia Today, they have been perhaps providing media reporting that makes the tensions worse rather than better?
No, absolutely not. You should make really a picture for yourself. Go to Russia Today, watch the coverage.
Here's a headline. Here's a headline that was on yesterday.
And look,
Kiev wants to spark war between NATO and Russia. That's a headline on Russia Today from yesterday, Wednesday of this week. Is that not an inflammatory headline?
No, it's not inflammatory. It's it may be opinion-driven, but it's not inflammatory, and it's absolutely well. Go to the Fox News webpage. I mean, it's.
You're not going to get an argument from me. They are very inflammatory.
Sure. Or even to MSNBC or those liberal media actually accusing Russia of annexation of Crimea, which is, again, totally inaccurate in terms. I don't think that that headline that you just picked out of RT's very comprehensive coverage of what's going on in Ukraine is first inflammatory or representative of the whole coverage. And please go to the website of our agency and just watch those stories. Unnarrated, uncommented, raw video with the net sound, with the sound bites of the people whom our journalists, none of them Russian by the way, filmed there on the ground in eastern Ukraine.
Okay, let me ask you, Anton Troyanovsky, that headline, Kiev fomenting conflict between NATO and Russia. Is there any real risk of a larger armed conflict in the region as a whole between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and Russia? Is that really a possibility here? And could it occur, if not by intent, perhaps by accident?
No one wants that. I think Putin has said Russia doesn't want that. Obama has said the US doesn't want that. Certainly Angela Merkel, at the very beginning of the stuff happening in Crimea, said very clearly acting militarily is not an option for us. Obviously, also, the members of NATO have said they'll come, you know, they'll honor their agreements to defend any attack on NATO's borders. And people in the Baltic states, in particular, have been worried about that happening. But I think at this point that's there. Even if there is no military confrontation between NATO and Russia, there's many other ways in which this situation could get worse that we should really be worried about.
Irina Solonenko, there are some in the U.S., John McCain, the senior U.S. Republican senator, for example, he would like to see the U.S. provide some arms to Kiev, to the government. Would that be a good idea? We've seen certainly that the armed forces in Ukraine are under-equipped and definitely have some control issues as well.
Well, it would be too sensitive if NATO or US interferes. But for instance, let's look at the European Union. It has a common security policy. For the past 20 years, EU had 22 police operations, police and peacekeeping operations all over the world, including in Europe, in Kosovo. I think it would be a more reasonable way to help, maybe to stabilize the situation in Ukraine, to send some of the a peacekeeping or police mission from the EU, for instance. Just to observe, maybe, to make sure there are no tensions, it's calm, and so on. It would be a more reasonable way. And I think EU has other leverages, economic sanctions. Russia is very dependent on selling gas to the European Union, on trade, and I think EU will not suffer as much if it introduces economic sanctions, whereas Putin perhaps makes a second thought about what he's doing.
And the US did announce that, that they will send non-lethal aid to Ukraine, including, I think, helmets.
They're also promising money, as is the EU, but are they doing enough? And won't that money flow right into the coffers of Gazprom?
Money to Ukraine? I mean, there are, certainly, especially if you talk to officials here in Berlin, but I think also all over Europe, there is concern about corruption going on in Ukraine and continuing. You know, that's not going to stop overnight with any new government.
Well, not only corruption, they've got a big open bill with Gazprom. They owe Gazprom a lot of money.
Yes, and if you look at it's been interesting to watch Gazprom actually here in Germany. They've been working very hard to convince the German public that they have nothing to fear about Gazprom shutting off gas deliveries to Europe, whatever happens.
Let's talk about what kind of diplomatic and political solutions might be out there. The meeting in Geneva did say that all the parties will continue to talk. They do plan to have future meetings with one another. Is that a success in itself, Ivan Rodionov, that people are finally sitting down and actually meeting face-to-face? That had not happened, of course, until now. Sergei Lavrov and the Ukraine foreign minister were at one point in the same building but did not meet. Is this a sign of progress in itself?
No, as you know, Russia does not recognize that government in Kiev, so I don't see actually much chance for Lavrov to talk directly to the appointed foreign minister of Ukraine. But in this tense situation, of course, the mere fact of the talks is something encouraging, although I have to agree with the Russian position that for those talks to succeed, the representatives of the protest movement in the eastern part of Ukraine should be involved, and the leaders of this movement who were abducted and jailed in Kiev should be released, obviously, so that all sides of the conflict are represented, because this movement in eastern Ukraine is now also a factor, if you want it or not. It's not Russia. It's about the people of Ukraine not aligning, standing against their government the way that they stood in Kiev against Yanukovych's government. Now it's vice versa. It's a turn-page situation. Same occupation of public buildings, but while they were enthusiastically applauded in December and January, now it is called pro-Russian separatism. Again, using this term to label those people who are just opposing the government.
You are very much retranslating a Russian position, official position. It's very interesting, because Mr. Lavrov several days ago said that Russia would accept taking part in negotiations in Geneva only on the condition if a representative from eastern Ukraine is present. And he actually named a name, Mr. Dobkin, who is active in Kharkiv, and he's known also for supplying the sacks to Euromaidan to beat protesters. And come on, if you name somebody from outside and saying this is a representative of separatists, I don't know, or people who fight for whatever in eastern Ukraine, it should be in Geneva. What kind of position is that?
The U.S. government, represented by Victoria Nuland, said we want Yatsenyuk to head the Ukrainian government, and now Yatsenyuk is at the helm. Does it give you any worries, any concerns?
Well, he didn't say it officially.
Let me ask you about a further point of the Geneva talks. They also agreed that they will work together to try to disarm and disband irregular military groups. How much difference does that make, do you think, Irina Solonenko, and how effective can it be? Some of these groups actually were not particularly heavily armed anyway, and some of the arms they're using, they've taken away from your country's own military.
Yeah, there's a question, who is going to disarm? The Ukrainian police, Ukrainian military, which is taking part in anti-terrorist operation, that's how it's called, is trying to disarm them, but it's quite difficult. So will Russia disarm people whom it sent? That would be very important, but I don't know. Otherwise, who else is going to disarm them? So that's, okay, they agreed, but so what?
And another problem I see in those talks in Geneva is that with the US, you actually never know who calls the shots. Is it Obama administration, or is it neocons? Is it military-industrial complex, or is it that huge intelligence community that seems to be completely gotten out of hand and spies on world leaders without their own presidents knowing? So that's a problem also for Russia and for all involved in those talks, that with the US, you never know who is where's the decision-making sort of nerve center in the particular situation regarding Ukraine.
I mean, I think certainly the conservative establishment in the U.S. would have wanted Obama to act a lot more aggressively in this situation.
But they ruled out military force right from the beginning. They don't want any boots on the ground. So where's the real difference? What would they really have done differently?
No, that's what I'm saying, is the conservative establishment didn't want him to rule out military force, did want the U.S. government to provide military aid to Ukraine. So I think just in terms of this question of calling...
From the beginning, they said, we will never send forces into Ukraine. And certainly that was the words of McCain and of every other neocon as well. So I don't see the real... and we see what the U.S. is doing, and they are not delivering even weapons at the moment.
Right, exactly. So I'm saying that this shows, I think, that it's not the neocons standing behind Obama here and calling the shots. Obama has been a lot more, focused on calling for talks and calling for de-escalation then. And he's gotten a ton of criticism back home from the Republicans and from conservative commentators.
Let me ask you whether you think that continuing talks, they said they will continue to meet in different formats. Will that be effective, do you think, in defusing this situation, along with measures to disarm those irregular militias? I
mean, it does seem to be the most promising course of action. I don't know what else Obviously, the question is how you talk and in what what sort of trust the various parties have in one another. Right now, there does not seem to be much trust among the parties, and that's a real problem. But it seems like that's what you have to do.
It might be just a rhetoric without any practical implications, right?
I'm sorry?
It might have been just a rhetoric without practical implications. They told, okay, we're going to disarm, but then what?
The question is also, Ivan Rodionov, whether at this point the genie is out of the bottle, as we say. The separatist impulse clearly has taken fire in the East. Do you really think that political measures, diplomatic measures from above, can get it back under control?
Certainly not. It is a factor. Well, external influence is a factor, but not the crucial factor. The decision is with the people in Ukraine, of course, and it's beyond any doubt, beyond any question, that it's about forming and establishing a government that all the people who live in Ukraine feel themselves represented by, and they're not scared by.
That is going to happen on May 25th. Elections are scheduled.
Well,
Russia has said it may or may not recognize the results of those elections.
The problem is that now we have, at least, judging by the Ukrainian constitution, a government which is not covered by the constitution, a government which, by the way, as the first step, when they came to power in the night of February 22nd, after banning the Russian language as the second official language,
was vetoed by the president.
Yes, after an angry call from Barroso, from Brussels, it was vetoed.
Okay, but let's look to the future, because we don't have that much more time in our program.
But
elections on May 25th. Does that promise to improve that situation?
This casts the shadow on the future, of course. If you have a government that violates the constitution, you either send the government to jail, or you change or abolish the constitution. I mean, it's irreconcilable paradox that now exists in Ukraine.
Okay, but 6 weeks until May 25th, a little longer, that could change that situation. Irina Solonenko, what do you expect from those elections? Can they help to put the country back on a stable and unified course? And do they need to be accompanied by a referendum on a federal structure? This is one compromise proposal that has been made, including by Mr. Turchinov. Is that a possibility? Would that help?
Well, to have elections is very important. It will bring a legitimate president to power. The president has many less functions now than before due to the change of the constitution. So it's much more important, I think, to have early parliamentary elections, and which would ensure that you will bring new parties into the parliament. There are small young parties which grew out of civil society. It's very important to give them the possibility to run elections. I would like to mention that in the past 2 weeks, actually, the government, the parliament adopted quite a few important laws. Like today, the law on creation of the public TV broadcasting was voted. The plan was to do this after the Orange Revolution, but they failed. And now, finally, it's going to happen. It's very important to have impartial state-funded TV, but which will be independent. Apart from that, there was a law on public procurement which reduces corruption substantially, or risks of corruption. There was a law on judiciary which, according to which judges who were unjustly ruled against the protesters will have to be fired and replaced. So basically it's about returning trust in judiciary and so on. So even in this situation, the parliament is passing important legislation. And
undoubtedly all important initiatives, but Andrei Troyanovsky, are those the kind of initiatives that are likely to convince people in the East that it's worthwhile to stay within the country? Do we need to see something like a federalization referendum in order to give them more autonomy? Would that work?
I mean, if you listen to the leaders in Western Europe and the US, I think they have been calling on the government in Kiev to reach out more to the provinces in the east, to actually travel there, to try to show that they care about the whole country. So I think some of those measures and actually showing kind of good faith efforts to unite the country will be important. The debate over federalization is obviously, to what extent does that give, does that still allow Ukraine to act as one country to have national sovereignty. Western criticism of that plan has been that federalization would be sort of a veiled effort for the Kremlin to gain control over what's happening in East Ukraine. So that's the kind of stuff that's going to have to be worked out.
It makes sense maybe to talk about decentralization rather. If you look historically, federations were constructed out of independent states. So federalization is a process of integration for independent entities into one state. You cannot federalize a unitary state. So you should talk about decentralization.
Ivan Lodionov, some of the authorities in Kiev say federalization is simply a subterfuge by Moscow to try to gain indirect control and would only create more corruption in all of the new federal entities that would be created. Is there something to that argument?
Well, I think there is already enough corruption in Ukraine and in Kiev as it is. Irina obviously did some research into the Ukrainian record of oligarchs and corruption, so certainly we have here a bigger authority on this particular issue. But as I see it, there is no solution to the problem without popular vote in the eastern parts of the country. Certainly, the people who live in Donetsk and Kharkiv will not believe just upon a kind word to the Kiev government that everything is going to be fine after May 25th, and they will get autonomy, as you say, and that the whole structure will be decentralized. They want to have hard facts on their hand before it happens, because they learned from the recent past how that opposition, which is now forming the government, just dismisses any contracts, any treaties, any agreements signed the night before, and just proceeds creating facts. So
let me briefly get a last answer from Irina Solonenko. If a referendum were to be held, how would such a vote come out? One social sciences institute in Donetsk said only 15% of the people that they polled want to see a federal structure.
Exactly. So that's a good question, but there might be a lot of speculation, and it's speculations which are very populistic. Of course, people want to have more autonomy, more powers, but it depends how you frame questions, what kind of awareness raising you do. At the moment, I don't see preconditions, and people really want a unitary state, from what I know as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today, and thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. We'll be bringing you more coverage of the situation in Ukraine. Stay with DW for that. Bye-bye.